most memorable image of Tom is from the time when he was to chair a department meeting. He arrived unavoidably late. He entered the room half walking, half dancing, with an impish smile and a baseball hat on his head that was pushed back with a logo of his favorite team. He proceeded to, as always, masterfully lead the meeting. But this was emblematic of Tom, a kind of leprechaun who cared about everyone and who led not only with his head intellectually, but also with his heart. Tom Dunfee was on multiple occasions chair of the Department of Legal Studies and Business Ethics. He was the first director of the Zicklin Center. Long before I met my wonderful colleagues in the department, I knew Tom well, and were it not for Tom, I would not be here. He was passionately committed to the institutionalizing of ethics in the nation's schools of business. That passion made a huge difference. When he began, the enterprise was in its infancy. But were it not for Tom, the maturation, the meteoric rise of this area could never have happened. Would not have happened but for the person for whom this series is named, Thomas W. Dunfee. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. So in a moment, I will introduce Professor Anderson, but I would be remiss if I didn't first thank various people who have helped to make today possible. So first and foremost, Loretta Tomasco, who is all of your applause. She's Associate Director of the Carol and Lauren Zicklin Center for Business Ethics Research, and she really does deserve top billing, I think, for today's event. The event has had a number of moving parts, and Loretta has handled them all with her usual grace and her unfailing good cheer. Also crucial to the success of today's events, Tamara English and Gail Davis, whose spectacular planning and logistical support helped to make this event and all of the surrounding events possible too. And last, but certainly not least, a very special and genuinely heartfelt thanks to Bill Dunfee, whom I may have lost. So Bill is the director of the Zicklin Center for Business Ethics Research, and the idea to have this Dunfee lecture series originates with Bill. It's through his directorship that the event has been made possible. And then because Bill is exceptionally generous, he declined to choose the speaker for today himself, instead giving that opportunity to other members of the department. And it's very much in the spirit of Bill's general orientation to his colleagues and his students. He's really someone who wants to allow other people's voices to shine. When he did ask for others to suggest names, who would be a good speaker for this very first instantiation of the Dunfee Lecture Series, it was very, very easy to come up with Professor Anderson, because there's really no one who's doing more important or more exciting work on the ethics of the market society than her. Turning now to Professor Anderson, she is the Arthur F. Thurnau Professor and John Dewey Distinguished University Professor of Philosophy and Women's Studies at the University of Michigan. She's the author of scores of articles, as well as 3 groundbreaking books. First, Value in Ethics and Economics. Second, The Imperative of Integration. That book won the American Philosophical Association's 2011 Joseph E. Gittler Award for, quote, an outstanding scholarly contribution in the field of the philosophy of one or more of the social sciences. And most recently, private government. Those of you who are in my LGST 100 class are now very familiar with private government. How employers rule our lives and why we don't talk about it. And for that book, she won the Progress Medal in 2018 by the Society for Progress. Professor Anderson is currently working on the history of egalitarianism with a special focus on how groups come to make moral progress. Professor Anderson's scholarship is notable for its interdisciplinary engagement and for its sustained commitment to what she calls democratic equality, a state of affairs in which individuals can relate to one another as equals. Her work is also notable for its accessibility. Unfortunately, accessibility is not a pervasive feature in much philosophical writing, but Professor Anderson's writing is really a model in this respect. And in addition to that, one of the things that I like best about her writing is its ability to really transform one's conception in powerful ways. And oftentimes, those ways are they borrow from the novelist's toolkit, I would say. So, like an Ursula Le Guin or a Margaret Atwood, Professor Anderson can deploy a dystopian vision to make salient grave social ills. And that's true whether she's trying to call our attention to the oppressive nature of hierarchies and corporations, or the contempt that luck egalitarianism betrays for less able or less talented or less charming. In January of this year, Professor Anderson was the subject of a New Yorker profile. And you have to understand that for philosophers or academics perhaps more generally, this is the equivalent of like having been given a Hollywood star. Except it's even better than that because it involves a distillation of one's most important ideas for a popular audience. Now, as with all profiles, the New Yorker piece is long on details of its subject's biography. And I think in that way, it honors a truth about the best scholarly work. The best scholarly work comes from a place of personal, heartfelt, lived experience. And that's a truth that Professor Anderson's work, I think, really compellingly embodies. And so it is my greatest pleasure to have Professor Anderson at Wharton today. And with that, I will turn things over to her.
It's a great honor to be able to address you as the inaugural Dunfee lecturer, and it's a huge pleasure to be back in Philadelphia, which were sort of my haunts as an undergraduate because I was an undergraduate at Swarthmore College nearby. So it's just lovely to address you. My topic today is the work ethic. It's something I've been researching quite intensively in the past year or so. And as I was digging back into the history of the work ethic, which was invented by a bunch of 17th century Puritan ministers, I came to realize how deeply my own attitudes are informed by the work ethic and how deeply I identify with it. So this lecture is about how much we really ought to be identifying with the work ethic and what we should make of it today once we understand what it was originally and how it's been passed down to us. So let's start off thinking about the American-style work ethic. What is it? What is that? How do we manifest it in our lives today? Well, many of us think of our occupation, our careers, as central to our personal identities. You go to a party and you ask, what do you do? In many countries in Europe, it's considered sort of rude to ask that question, but here it's often the first question Americans ask. We think that work, hard work, builds character. A lot of us feel like we ought to be on call at all hours, and if we don't feel that way, our boss certainly feels that way about us. There's a deep stigma of unemployment. One study found that the experience of unemployment is as bad for American workers as, death of a spouse. There's a stigma attached to getting free stuff, welfare. You should be working for all that stuff, right? Cultures of performative workaholism, right? Displaying how hard you're working. This is all part of the American-style work ethic. Here you can see one manifestation of that. The United States is, oops, just a moment. Looks like I'm not getting it. The United States, over on the far right, is the only rich country in the world that doesn't have guaranteed, legally mandated paid vacation. Look at what all these other countries do. They have spectacular amounts of guaranteed paid vacation. Now, a good number of Americans, of course, have contractual rights to vacation, but then when they study how many days Americans actually take of the vacation they're contractually entitled to, they take about half of what they're entitled to. Okay, you're not going to see that among most Europeans. So, in that light, let's consider some criticisms of the work ethic, and here we'll be looking back in time. So we start from the present. David Graeber, an anthropologist at the London School of Economics and an anarchist, recently came out with a book titled Bullshit Jobs. And this is how he defines bullshit jobs. Paid employment so pointless, unnecessary, or pernicious that even the employee can't justify its existence, although the employee must pretend that this is not the case. Okay, and Graeber claims that a lot of work these days is like that. He contrasts bullshit jobs with shit jobs. Those are jobs that are actually valuable, that actually promote human welfare, but they're forms of drudgery. Think about, say, nurses' aides cleaning bedpans, things like that. They tend to be poorly paid, and the people who do that work tend to be get very little respect, whereas bullshit jobs tend to be middle-class jobs that actually get higher pay and decent amounts of respect, even though they are pointless or pernicious. How pervasive are these jobs? Graeber suggests maybe half of all work in modern capitalist economies is like this. Surveys in the United Kingdom and the Netherlands of workers, 37 to 40% of them declared that the jobs they were working in were bullshit jobs. American office workers report that about half their time is devoted to real work and the other half is just devoted to bullshit tasks, or they're just waiting around for something to do. But even when they're waiting around, they have to look busy to keep up appearances. Last semester, I taught a course on work to my undergraduates, and we did a little section on bullshit jobs. So I just surveyed my class. Well, how many of you have worked in bullshit jobs? And 40% of them raised their hands. Okay, so what kind of jobs were these? Well, here are two of my favorite examples from my students. One example was a student who was working at a job at a firm, and he was required to write reports that no one read. Okay, that would be a bullshit job. How did he know that no one read them? Because he had to upload his reports onto a website which recorded the number of times the report was downloaded, and it was 0. So he knew. A second bullshit job, this is my second favorite case. A student was had previously been hired to be a research assistant for a laboratory, and the research assistant's job was fantastic because she's actually engaged in research as part of a team. The next summer, she was promoted to be a research assistant coordinator, okay, at higher pay, higher rank. It's a great line on the CV because it's a promotion. But she had no assigned duties. She's supposed to be coordinating the research of the research assistants, but all the research assistants, of course, insisted on their own autonomy. She had nothing to do. So another bullshit job. Graeber proposes that in light of all this worthless work, why don't we just eliminate all those bullshit jobs And then we could cut the work week in half. We just share around the rest of the jobs, okay? And then we'll have a leisure society. Now, this is not a new idea. We just step back in time to John Maynard Keynes, the great economist, who wrote in 1930 a famous essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, in which he imagines what the economy would be like 100 years hence, that is only about 10 years from now. And he predicted that the productivity of advanced capitalist economies would be spectacularly higher than in 1930. That is a true prediction. So high that everyone could be taken care of and have a quite decent standard of living. And what more would you need? Everyone would be, have a decent standard of living. So why work towards endless accumulation after that? We should just be happy with a steady state economy. He argued that once we reach that point, by the year 2030, we will come to recognize that the endless pursuit of wealth accumulation is completely pathological. It makes no sense. That we shouldn't always be thinking, well, I have to work more and maybe in retirement I'll finally get my leisure. That's delusional. You take it now. Instead, we should simply set aside the work ethic as an obsolete ideal and embrace the leisure society. Graeber was simply channeling Keynes in suggesting that the remaining necessary work that would have to be done could be done in a brief period of time. Keynes suggested 3 to 4 hours a day, which, by the way, is the typical amount of time that hunter-gatherers have to spend gathering their subsistence. But now we go back to the classic source on the work ethic. This is Max Weber, who wrote by far the most influential work on the work ethic. It's called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, that he wrote in 1920. At least that's when it was published. And this is what Weber had to say about the work ethic. Firstly, that the Puritans who invented the work ethic bestowed an amazingly good conscience in the acquisition of money. And that their invention of the work ethic ended up rationalizing the capitalist exploitation of workers' increased willingness to work. That wasn't their plan. They weren't trying to be capitalists. They were trying to be good Christians. I'll explain why shortly. But that's what ended up happening as the work ethic secularized. His final conclusion about the value of the work ethic, that it had put us in an iron cage. The Puritan wanted to work in a calling, but we are forced to do so by the nature of the competitive free market capitalist system. It's a trap in which workers are forced by market forces to engage in endless drudgery for the sake of profit maximization of capitalists. Well, reading Weber, I thought, well, maybe I should go back and read what these Puritans were actually talking about. And Richard Baxter, one of the prime Puritan ministers who contributed to the work ethic, is a wonderful source to start from. Puritans basically were Calvinists. And Calvinist theology starts off with the premise shared with Lutherans of justification by faith alone. That is, people get saved simply in virtue of having faith that Jesus Christ is their Savior. But here's the difference between Calvinists and Lutherans. Lutherans, they think, I know in my heart if I'm saved, right? I know in my heart if I have faith. And so they have perfect confidence that they're saved because they can tell by introspection that they have faith. Puritans, they are total behaviorists. don't think you can tell by looking into your heart that you really have faith. Because think about the stakes. You could be damned to hell forever. And keep in mind, the Calvinists also believed in predestination, and a tiny number of elect would be saved. So everyone's desperate to believe that they have faith, right? Because they want to be saved. So they're going to just deceive themselves. So don't even bother looking into your head, okay? That's not good evidence one way or another about whether you are saved. Instead, the only sure sign of faith is shown in your behavior. Are you working for the greater glory of God? That's practical activity in the world. The Puritans are worldly consequentialists. You have to show in your action your faith, and you do that by engaging in constant, disciplined labor in a calling that is a specialized occupation. Whereas if you're just hanging around idly, lazily, that's a sign that you really don't have faith. So you better get to work. But it's all for theological reasons, okay? So in a wonderful work, Saints' Everlasting Rest, Baxter said, give diligence to make your calling and election sure. What he promised was everlasting rest. But that's only in the next life. In this life, you work relentlessly. Then finally you get your rest once you're saved and you're in heaven. So what did the work ethic amount to for the 17th century Puritans? Well, number one, you have to choose a calling that is a specialized occupation and then pursue it with discipline and diligence. Number two, don't waste your time. No idleness, okay? Importantly, they drew the conclusion that even the rich need a calling, even they need to work. Forget about those lazy landlords. They hated the aristocrats. Thirdly, you're not allowed to waste any material goods because God gave the earth to humanity to use to work up for the greater glory of God. Don't waste the earth's resources or anything we've made out of it. But at the same time, Calvinism is an ascetic doctrine. So you're not supposed to indulge in worldly pleasures or any kind of vanity. Well, that's something I think we're familiar with, right? No dancing, no partying, right? Fifthly, we're not allowed to be covetous. That is, you're not allowed to just want more and more stuff that you can't use for good purposes, more than you need to do your duty. But then they also say, this is a quote from Baxter, every man must frugally getteth and saveth as much as he can. And he translates that into a duty that if you have a choice between two callings and one pays more than the other, you should take the higher paying one. I'm going to suggest in a moment how you can reconcile the bar on covetousness with the demand that you maximize your income. They have a solution to this. Okay, well, over time, the work ethic became secularized. Okay, and one of the critical aspects of secularization was that the goods that the work ethic promised to people got pulled from the next life into this one. So let's think about how this worked. And the left-hand column then will look at the theological work ethic of the original Calvinist Puritans, and then how that got secularized over time. So from a theological point of view, the Puritans, because they believed that wealth was a product of hard work, that you could infer whether someone was a sinner or a saint depending on how rich they were. Right? So the poor stand to the rich as lazy sinners stand to hardworking saints. When you think about how that gets secularized, it's very familiar. American sentiment, namely the idea that really respectable people are self-sufficient, and that the dependent poor, those who depend on free stuff from the welfare state, are undeserving, some stigma attached to them. Secondly, from a theological point of view, there was a bourgeois duty to maximize profits by disciplining workers. And that got secularized into the theory of shareholder capitalism. The idea that public policy should favor capital interests over labor interests, and that corporations should do likewise. Thirdly, one of the Puritans' favorite biblical phrases was that he who does not work shall not eat. So people have to work for their wages. It's kind of a low-wage policy, you might think, although we'll see a correction shortly to that thought. But what that means in secular terms is that one is to prefer private charity or some form of workfare over a generous welfare state that might be encapsulated in something like a universal basic income, which is given out unconditionally, or other unconditional welfare benefits. Fourthly, rest must always follow leisure, not precede it. Rest exists in order to recharge your batteries so you can go back to work. It's an instrumental rationale. So you have to earn it. And that's the American system, right? You got to earn your vacation. It's not going to be a government guaranteed benefit the way it is in all other rich countries where they have mandatory paid holidays. No, you got to earn it. Maybe you could get it in your labor contract if you're lucky, but otherwise you're not entitled to any paid vacation. Because Calvinism is an ascetic doctrine, work itself is seen as good ascetic discipline, right? If you have to toil away in drudgery, that'll keep your mind off temptation. And it's imposed. And in secular terms, that got turned into what we might call the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, which we see in the modern workplace. But that's the conservative path to secularization. That's the path that Max Weber and David Graeber and John Maynard Keynes condemned. And what I want to suggest to you is that that only gets half the story. In fact, the Puritans are way more interesting than that and kind of contradictory, perhaps, because there was another side of the work ethic. And here, I just want to stress, you find out what the work ethic is by reading a lot of sermons, okay? And you shouldn't think that these Puritans are just about fire and brimstone, much less that they were about witches and things like that. In fact, the Puritans were hard-headed empiricists, for the most part. When it was asked of them, what should we do in our leisure time? They said, well, you could take up the hobby of undertaking scientific experiments. That would be good. Not dancing, right? Not partying. Scientific experiments. So here I have Robert Sanderson depicted here to help us reconsider the calling. Now, what's amazing about Sanderson is he gave a wonderful sermon on how to know what your calling is. God calls you to a specific occupation. But again, because they're hard-headed empiricists and really don't believe in fancy superstition and magical stuff, Sanderson cautions, don't expect a divine revelation to reveal to you what your calling is. In fact, when you read this sermon, you realize that Sanderson invented modern career counseling. So he says, well, how are you supposed to know what your calling is? Well, look at your talents. What would you be good at? Look at your personal tastes. What occupation would fit your personality and temperament? What would you be happy doing? Look at your education. What are you prepped to do? And finally, talk seriously to your parents because they love you and have some insights into what kind of occupation would make you happy. So, what's wonderful about this, and this was a very characteristic Puritan turn, is that what starts off as a rigorous duty to God turns into a right to follow one's own path, right? It's a right to freedom of occupational choice, and that was a radical move in those days. You know, in the 17th century, people thought, well, you ought to do what your father did. The Puritans are saying, no, you follow your heart. You follow your talents. It might be very different from what your father did. The Puritans also said that work has to be for the greater glory of God. But what is the greater glory of God anyways? What kind of work would advance the glory of God? Well, sure, you can build churches and stuff, but not many people are doing that. They definitely didn't think that working for the greater glory of God could consist in prayer. That was that monkish stuff, and they hated that lifestyle. No. You shouldn't waste your time. You know, prayer, you can do that on Sundays, but no, work has to have worldly consequences. It has to, in fact, advance human welfare. And indeed, you read the Puritans carefully and you realize they were the first utilitarians. You have to maximize human welfare. Here's another Puritan minister, John Angier, writing in 1647. He says, "We all must spiritualize our callings and earthly businesses." What he's saying here is we have to understand our earthly conduct as doing God's work. This is honorable. It's erasing the line between the sacred and the profane. All of our worldly business activity becomes sacralized. And what that means is that the duty to God actually turns into a right also, a right to meaningful and respected work. The work is meaningful because it has to be contributing to human welfare, not just to your own personal vanity, but something that really helps other people. And secondly, it's respected. It doesn't matter how lowly your calling is, it must be recognized as doing God's work, promoting human welfare. And so the people who do it are equal in the eyes of God to the most exalted person in society. What I'm suggesting here is that Weber, Keynes, Graeber only get it half right. It is true that as ascetics, there is a harsh disciplinary aspect to the work ethic. But the Puritans had a whole pro-worker work ethic on the other side of that. It's supposed to give meaning to our lives. Okay? So they insisted on the dignity of all workers in recognizing that even the most menial workers do God's work. The citations, by the way, are to Richard Baxter's 5-volume Christian Directory. It's a wonderful, comprehensive guide to Christian ethics from a Puritan point of view. You can find this online. It makes great reading. I was working and Baxter also is a minister of immense influence. I've talked to a couple of Presbyterian ministers saying I was reading Baxter, and they remember Baxter very fondly from seminary training. Baxter wrote 150 books, okay, hugely prolific, and his books are still are read today. Baxter says also, that people are, the work, a calling has to be meaningful work. That is, it has to consist in honest labors that are profitable to the Commonwealth. That is, that help the public, not just yourself. He insisted that workers are entitled to relief from employer abuses. He tells employers to rule your servants. Don't rule them tyrannically. Don't yell and scream at them. You have to love your servants. Servants are also entitled to safe and healthful conditions. They're entitled to fair and living wages. Individuals have a right to charity. If they're poor, they have a right for their poverty to be relieved. There's a duty to give to charity corresponding to that right. And finally, the saints' everlasting rest is the reward of disciplined labor in this world. Okay, so no vacation, sorry. But once you're saved in heaven, it's eternal rest, so you get it all made up for, right? Baxter insisted that the rich have duties too, primarily to engage in productive labor. This is really serious. Okay, the rich are not allowed, even if they could afford it, to just live off their rents and interest. No. In fact, Baxter asks, well, I mean, suppose you could live off your rents and interest. Would it be okay to do that? And he said no, because God commanded Adam after the fall that he work by the sweat of his brow to the end of his days. That's a universal command. By the way, Locke said the same thing. He asked that question and answered it exactly the same way that Baxter did. So, God hath strictly commanded labor to all, including the rich. But even more, this is very, very important. He condemned modes of working that consisted simply in wealth extraction. He said, it's a prison and a constant calamity to be tied to spend one's life in doing little good at all to others, though he should grow rich by it himself. What he's saying here, it's not okay to maximize your income if you're doing so in such a way that doesn't actually benefit humanity. If it's just benefiting yourself, it's a calamity. He has a whole chapter, in fact, a couple of chapters on what he calls oppression, which is basically a condemnation of unfair and exploitative business models. Puritans were really sharp business ethicists. They're really thinking about practical action in the world here in business terms. So he says, do not tread on your brethren as stepping stones of your own advancement. Think about that next time you're in a competitive corporate context. Do not injure your inferiors who are unable to resist. This is very, very important. What he's telling business people is they're not entitled to take advantage of another person's desperation or vulnerability in order to squeeze them just to get more profits out of them. He condemned monopolists, usurers. He didn't think all charging of interest is okay. He has an elaborate set of rules for when it's okay to charge interest. But excessive interest is definitely not okay. Various kinds of hucksters, engrossers are people who are trying to corner the market. No, none of that's allowed. He condemns unfair evictions of tenants. And here's something that Locke drew from Baxter. Locke argued that it's wrong to engage in price discrimination against the poor and desperate. So if you're willing to sell an item for a given price at a given location, you have to offer that price to every one who appears. Even if someone seems especially desperate to get that item, you're not allowed to jack up the price just because you know they're desperate for it. Puritans also invented the doctrine of effective altruism. We know that today from Peter Singer, probably the most influential applied ethicist in America today, who wrote this book, The Life You Can Save, which is all about the doctrine of effective altruism. That is that not only should you give a huge chunk of your income away, perhaps most of it, but you should do that in a way that's welfare maximizing. Well, how did that come out of the work ethic? Remember, we had this little contradiction. It seemed like a contradiction before, and we can actually logically deduce the doctrine of effective altruism from Puritan premises. So first, you're required to maximize your income. You're not allowed to waste any of it. All of it has to be put to good use. Oh, but you're not allowed to spend it on yourself because that would be covetous and self-indulgent. But you gotta spend it on something. So if you've piled up mountains of wealth, you can't spend it on yourself, but you have to spend it. There's really nothing left to spend it on but public works and our needy brethren. There it is. Peter Singer, great secular utilitarian, is simply channeling 17th century Puritan moralists. This is what he says. Singer could practically be quoted saying the identical thing. The portions or comeliest clothing of your children must rather be neglected than the poor be suffered to perish. Peter Singer said essentially the same thing in a famous article he wrote a couple decades ago called Famine, Affluence, and Morality. I wrote to Peter and I said, do you realize that you're just kind of remaking Richard Baxter, 17th century Puritan morality? He was delighted to learn about this, by the way. Okay, so what I suggest is that Graeber, Keynes, Weber, they only had it half right. Yes, there is this conservative path to secularization that led to a rather harsh doctrine for ordinary workers, but there's this whole other pretty progressive side to the Puritans that leads to what I'll call the progressive path to secularization. So let's see how that went. Well, workers are honored on the theological conception for following a sacred calling. And so secularized, that amounts to the demand that all workers are entitled to dignity and respect and meaningful work, not bullshit jobs. Both the theologians and the secular version, of course, believe in free occupational choice, depending on your talents and tastes and so forth. Baxter argued that workers were entitled to a frugal living wage. Okay, it's not going to be generous, but when that became secularized, it became the idea that workers are entitled to high and rising wages. Think about how labor unions, right? That's what they're for, right? To secure for their the workers they represent high and rising wages. The theologian said there's a right and duty to charity. Secularized, that becomes the right to social insurance. There's a fascinating history running through Thomas Paine, the great American revolutionary. I've written about that. We can talk about that in Q&A. The Puritans promised leisure in the next life, but under secularization, we pull the goods of heaven into earth. And so that becomes a right to paid vacation, paid leave, maximum hours legislation, so that workers actually earn their rest here on earth and are entitled to it. Finally, the idea of work as a kind of internalized self-discipline. And importantly, the Puritans thought that everyone was capable. So Baxter was somewhat heterodox. Most of the Puritans thought there was a tiny number of elect But Baxter had a famous essay in which he argued for universal salvation, that salvation was actually open to everyone who manifested hard work, right? Because that's really the sign of faith, right? If you're really diligent. And secularized, that becomes the ideal of worker self-governance. Well, I can internalize the work ethic, I can discipline myself, I can govern myself qua worker. Okay, that's coming out of the Puritans. And secularized, it becomes a demand either for self-employment or for workers' collectives. There's a fascinating history behind that as well, some of which I've written up in my book, Private Government. So here's one of the legacies of the Puritans. So now we're already in a pretty secularized version. But many of the classical liberals actually are following through on the progressive secularization of the work ethic. So we have Adam Smith, Tom Paine, even Abe Lincoln, opposing all forms of unfree labor whatsoever. Of course, famously against slavery, but also against serfdom, all kinds of peonage, indentured servitude. Adam Smith actually argued against unpaid apprenticeships. Think of that, those of you who've had unpaid internships. It's the same thing, right? No, you're entitled to be paid, said Smith. Okay. John Locke famously argued that the right to property is founded on labor, and Adam Smith followed him in that view, coming straight out of the work ethic. That is, property rights aren't by grant of the king, just because you suck up to him. No, they're there because you work the land. Locke also famously invented the labor theory of value. That was picked up by Smith and the later classical economists. Smith famously argued for high wages. He told employers, if you're complaining that your workers are lazy and aren't working hard, it's because you're not paying them enough. You can elicit really good, hard work by paying them decent wages. Condorcet and Paine argued for social insurance, universal, comprehensive social insurance. Paine was the first one to realistically cost out a program of universal social insurance and stakeholder grants for young adults just starting out, and showed that it was well within the means of the budget, the available tax revenues for England. John Stuart Mill, a late classical liberal, argued, he thought that legislated limits to the length of the working day could be justified in one of his exceptions to the principle of laissez-faire. Mill also famously argued for an ideal of workers' cooperatives, workers collectively owning and governing the enterprises at which they worked. Tom Paine favored more of an individual self-employment model for America, basically based on the paradigm of the yeoman farmer. So now, once we see that the work ethic has this progressive side to it, this pro-worker side, let's consider the work ethic today. Has it carried forth the pro-worker side or the more conservative, disciplinary, ascetic side? Well, I'm focusing here on the United States. Let's see what's happened recently. Here we could see a very nice productivity growth in the American economy, but there's an inflection point in the mid-1970s. It's about 1973 or so, where hourly compensation stagnated, even though productivity was galloping ahead. Whereas from World War II until that point, wages were rising in concert with productivity. That gap between productivity and hourly compensation, that's just bigger and bigger chunk taken by capital. Here we can see CEO compensation as a ratio of ordinary workers' compensation. You can see it was actually, that's the blue line. You can see it was very, very modest back in the day, and now it's galloped ahead. One of my favorite pieces that I give to my students is a profile of a CEO of a major Connecticut corporation in, I can't remember exactly the year, but it's like 1955 or something. If you run the consumer price index on it, so you can find the salary in today's terms, $400,000 a year. The profile was about his lifestyle, and you know, this is the rich and famous back then. Not famous so much, but relatively rich at the time. He was at high 1%er, $400,000 a year. He had 2-car garage. Imagine that. 4-bedroom house in the suburbs. He had, do you know what he did on vacation? He had a little fishing boat on a little lake, and he would just go fishing. Sort of like not even very upper middle class today, right? But that was the CEO of a major corporation in Connecticut. Obviously, CEOs today aren't living such modest lives. One of the consequences of this is the United States, among the rich countries of the world, the United States has one of the highest rates, it's the red bar there, of working poverty. Well, maybe not rich countries. I was talking to Linda Tisar, economist at University of Michigan, who's an expert on Greece. And she said the mistake that people make about Greece is that they think of it as a developed economy. But you can see here, United States in-work poverty rates are, lower only than Greece and Spain's. So this is what's really happened, and I'm just quoting Warren Buffett here, he ought to know. There's class warfare, all right, but it's my class, the rich class, that's making war, and we're winning. Okay, that's what's been happening. In other words, what Americans have gotten, the side of the work ethic, of the secularized work ethic that Americans have gotten is the harsh side for workers, not the progressive side. Well, some might think this is because the rich work a lot harder. And there's some truth to that, actually. If you look at hours worked, you can see it's most prominent among men. But as you move from low income to middle income to professional, you see larger and larger percentage of workers working more than 50 hours a week. Indeed, if you look at low income, in the gray bar there, you can see that overtime for low-income workers has actually dropped. And so you might think, well, maybe the rich are deserving. We're not looking at the idle rich here, the idle landlords of England. That's long gone. Now the rich, they're working like crazy. They're in the office of CEOs, working unbelievable hours, other highly compensated workers, working enormous numbers of hours. So does that make them deserving? Well, I urge you to reconsider that question in light of the progressive work ethic. Number one, the Puritans insisted that we shouldn't confuse being very busy with engaging at work that actually enhances the welfare of people other than oneself. To get rich without actually contributing to social welfare, Baxter condemned as a calamity, not as something to be proud of. Think about this. Counterfeiters can be very busy people, designing fake currency to spread around. They might be busy, but they're not working in any honorable or decent sense because they're not adding to human welfare beyond their own selves. So we can ask also, what is the business model by which one is gaining such wealth? Is it merely extracting wealth? Consider, for instance, vulture private equity, where you buy a company, maybe putting 20% down, you lard that company up with all kinds of debt to buy out the rest of it, and then you start awarding yourselves hundreds of millions of dollars of management fees. You could easily pull out more than a 25% you put down by radically cutting the workers' wages and by draining out its goodwill and degrading the quality of the product. There are many companies that ended that way. And so you could pull out a lot of money out of the company even as it collapses and leaves thousands of people unemployed. That's happened many times. I'm not saying all private equity is like that, but sometimes that's the model. Does the business model exploit the vulnerable? Think about people who go bankrupt because they're stuck with surprise medical bills. Last year, New York Times had an article about people go into surgery in an in-network hospital with an in-network surgeon who secretly hires a friend of his who's out of network to come in to do the last few stitches on surgery, just closing the wound, and then slams the poor person with a $60,000 bill for stitches that could have been performed essentially for free by a resident in the hospital. Or look at skyrocketing insulin costs. If you're in the business of pharmaceuticals where the actual cost of making the insulin is trivial, but then you decide you can jack up the price so high that people die for the inability to afford it, are you actually pursuing? Presumably the point of making insulin is to help people who need it and not deprive them of access to it. Are you making profits by misleading people, selling them the fake dream that they can become rich by entering a multi-level marketing scheme, most of which 99% of people who buy in end up losing money on net? Or maybe you get rich from running a for-profit scam school where you train people to be computer technologists, computer technicians on computers that are obsolete and don't really train them for today's technology. Maybe your business model is based on shifting risks to the vulnerable. Maybe, for instance, you grab the pensions and then declare bankruptcy. Maybe your business model is based on making the earth uninhabitable. Oh, but there's lots of profits in that today. Maybe your business model gets a lot of revenue from spreading hate and propaganda and undermining democracy, which is what a lot of social media is doing these days. I think it's time for us to rethink our cult of wealth maximization. And I'm here speaking forthrightly and unashamedly as a philosopher, because philosophers have been thinking about this question for a long time. What is the good life? Thousands of years we've been asking this question, what's the good life? And many philosophers over this time have said, well, I mean, it's like getting rich. It's like, is that the good life? And remarkably, let's keep in mind that not every philosopher has been poor. Some of them have actually made really good money. My own dissertation advisor, John Rawls, got very wealthy off of the off of his copyright on A Theory of Justice. That's like a huge bestseller. Yet he would show up in seminar with patches on his elbows and sandals. Sam knows about that, right? He certainly didn't think that wealth maximization was the good life. But in fact, I can't find a single philosopher, including Adam Smith, who thought that if you reflected hard, that would really be the good life. Okay? And Baxter, of course, said the same thing. Mortify your own lusts. which maketh you think that you need so much as tempteth you to get it by oppressing others. No. That's a calamity. Think about how you're living, right? What even is the point of accumulating wealth beyond all consumption possibilities? The multi-billionaire Malcolm Forbes once ran an experiment. He wanted to see whether he could spend money as quickly as he was making it. So he calculated his net worth on a given day and held this immense birthday party for himself over a weekend, to which he flew out on private charter jets, hundreds of guests. He had everything imaginable: open bar, immense mountains of food, millions of bands, hot air balloons, every conceivable entertainment, hot tubs, whatever, right? No expenses spared. He calculated his net worth after blowing millions and millions of dollars on a party for hundreds of guests, and he was richer on Monday than he was on Friday, okay? He couldn't possibly spend the money on himself, okay? Doesn't make much sense. So why do people do it? Well, I'm actually rather partial to Rousseau's answer about why people are obsessively accumulating wealth beyond all possibilities of consumption. Rousseau, in his great essay on the origins of inequality, said, the reason why people do that is vanity. We're seeking the esteem of other people. People esteem people for their wealth. Have you ever seen a photograph of Trump's apartment in Trump Tower? Everything is gold-plated. Right? Everything. You should check it out. You should Google that. Right? He's showing off his wealth. That's how he thinks he's going to get esteem. But really, I mean, should we admire people just for being loaded? Does that even make any sense? Shouldn't we admire people? Now think about just in the business world. Shouldn't we admire people who are running businesses that actually benefit humanity, that produce worthwhile goods and services without destroying the earth, that actually promote human welfare on net? That's pretty admirable, but not just accumulating wealth through all these oppressive and vile business models. What are we going to do? What did the super rich have to do with that money? Well, a lot of what they do with it is they buy government influence. It's plutocracy, okay? But that, I think, is definitely a net negative for society, since they're not actually asking government to run in the interests of other people, just in the interest of themselves. So is there any actual use of vast wealth that isn't harmful to other people on net? Well, that was one place where the Puritans said, but we have philanthropy. Well, why don't we take the revived, secularized doctrine of philanthropy, which was created by Andrew Carnegie in a famous essay, The Gospel of Wealth, that he wrote in 1889. Indeed, we could see a direct line of thought from Richard Baxter to Andrew Carnegie to Bill Gates, who's pledged almost all his wealth to philanthropy, and to Singer, who advocates that. Okay? However, you know how Carnegie made his money? Through steelworks, where they were so dangerous that 20% of his workers died. You think maybe he should have spent a little money making his steelworks safer? No matter how much money you give away, and Carnegie, of course, endowed Carnegie Mellon University, endowed hundreds of libraries, public libraries across the country. No matter how much good you do with your philanthropy, it can't justify the way you made that money if you made it by hurting other people. And furthermore, we shouldn't be depending on the super rich through their largesse to remedy structural injustices. It's not how that works. So let's go back to Graeber and rethink what Graeber thinks is wrong with bullshit jobs. And I think that will help us see what the work ethic, maybe not what it does mean for us today, but what it ought to mean, what it could mean for us in the future. Graeber complains that the problem with bullshit jobs, it's not the bad pay because the pay is pretty good. It's not the indignity of the external reputation, since sometimes people have a pretty decent reputation in these jobs, but rather the spiritual violence inflicted on people from having to do pointless and pernicious tasks. He says, there's an indignity of being consigned to uselessness. It undermines your agency to be confined to doing work that has no further positive effects in the world, where you're just being busy for the sake of being busy without actually contributing to the welfare of humanity. He also complains of the spiritual violence, of the humiliation of being ordered to do worthless tasks just as a power play or to slake the vanity of the boss, who then makes you do this busy work, right? And some of it might actually be just flattering the boss. Maybe you're just part of his retinue around there to show how much power he has, or she. Graeber points out that prisons sometimes punish recalcitrant prisoners by forbidding them to work in the prison, doing laundry and things like that. So when I see Graeber's diagnosis of what's wrong with bullshit jobs, I actually don't see somebody who thinks that the leisure society is the solution. What I see here, I think his complaints are better motivated by the progressive work ethic than by the leisure ideal. I think what he's saying is people want to make a positive impact in the world, promoting the welfare of humanity in some respect or other. That's what's meaningful. That's what Baxter thought was meaningful. I think that's what most of us think is meaningful. So here's Amazon workers pledging a walkout on September 20th because they want to hold Amazon to an agenda of stemming climate change. Okay, they want meaningful work. That's why they're walking out. They're not walking out because of wages. Okay, they want to be part of an organization that's helping humanity rather than burning the earth to the ground. Okay? And so I want to close with a sentiment from another great Puritan, John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost. This is what he says about the fall. Adam and Eve are expelled from Eden. And this is the thought he puts into Adam's head. With labor, I must earn my bread, God tells me. But what harm is that? Idleness would have been worse. What I want to suggest to you is that Milton had something here. This is what the work ethic ought to be. It ought to be an ethic that provides people with work about which they could share Milton's sentiment. Where you could go to work every day and think, idleness would have been worse than doing my job diligently. Thank you. Yes, so the question is, why is it that the United States kind of followed through on the harsh conservative path to secularization, whereas other European countries, England, and also notably the Netherlands, by the way, they had their Puritans too, broadly speaking, Calvinists who had a work ethic. Why did they actually have paid vacations for their workers? That's the same question as the famous question, why is there no socialism in the United States? And there are many reasons for this. I'll give you two. One reason is because the United States was built on a certain kind of dream or promise for free workers that didn't pan out. The dream was universal self-employment, right? You're going to be a yeoman farmer. That's what Tom Paine thought was the blessing of the United States. Of course, it was coming at the expense of stolen land from American Indians. But that was the picture. And Lincoln, of course, promised it in his famous 1860 presidential stump speech. That's what makes us different. Free labor is not wage labor. Free labor is self-employment. And that's why Lincoln's two main presidential planks on his platform, anti-slavery, no extension of slavery into the territories, and giving away free land to anyone willing to farm it, the Homestead Act. Okay, and I think Americans have been drunk on that dream for, it's long past its sell-by date, but Americans are still seduced by that dream. Look at how many Americans are suckers for multi-level marketing schemes, all of which promise you can be independently wealthy and retire at, the age of 40. Doesn't happen, but Americans are always chasing that dream. So that's number one. Number two, racism. It's very difficult in the context of the legacy of slavery, and that legacy is racism, to bring together coalitions of black and white, multiracial coalitions of workers to gain anything, because that requires very high levels of cross-racial cooperation that historically has been easily destabilized in the United States. There are many other reasons, but those are two big ones.
So it seemed like at the beginning there were kind of two evils that we might be concerned about. One is the bullshit job, and the other was the kind of obsession with productivity that we have in our society. And I wonder whether your reconstruction of the work ethic helps save us from bullshit jobs, but not from our obsession with productivity. So consider the concert pianist, or the professional philosopher, or even the constitutional litigator. These are all people who have meaningful jobs, but there's a kind of competitiveness that I think, in order to pursue that sort of job, that drives us into the very productivity, obsession with productivity we might be afraid of.
Yeah, so the comment here is that it looks like my lecture is maybe helping us save ourselves from bullshit jobs, but not necessarily from the cult of productivity and the hyper-competitiveness around that. Productivity can mean a lot of different things. It depends on your metric. So I don't think that the right metric is profit maximization or wealth maximization. But especially in today's world, look, climate change is a reality. If you measure it in social welfare terms, we're going to have to be working really hard to manage that. It's going to have to be all hands on deck, frankly. And that will be very meaningful work. Saving people from heat waves, flooding, droughts and stuff. It's really important work. I don't think, if we're talking about life-saving work, that's super meaningful. Yes.
In part of the Dewey of Rich, you have said that the rich must spend their money on public works, and they can't spend on self-indulgence. So if that is true, if our society became such a society, And I can remember that you have said in private government that communism is horrible. So if our world become what you said, spend all the money on public works, why not communism?
Oh, why not communism? Depends on what you mean by communism. So in private government, what I suggest is that corporations themselves are like little communist governments, small c, not capital C. But we do know from the history of capital C communism that it's disastrous on many levels. People don't have freedom. They get crushed by government officials. If you're talking about like the state running the economy and owning everything, it makes people vulnerable to massive abuses on the part of state officials because they don't have an independent place to stand to resist state tyranny. And the other thing, too, is that we need multiple centers of experimentation. That one plan for the whole country often goes wrong. One of the virtues of a market society is you have lots and lots of little experiments. Most of them fail, but some of them come out really great. Yes?
So I just had a question about, so as the world changes, I was wondering how would you think we should convince up and coming philanthropists, for example, that abusing their power and creating a lot of money and then giving back later doesn't really justify abusing that power in the first place, as you mentioned. So how would you convince, let's say, 25-year-olds who are getting into this, for example, and want to become philanthropists in the future? How do we convince them to kind of shift their mindset?
I think we really have to borrow a leaf from Rousseau here. It's about changing the economy of esteem. People really have to take Baxter to heart. It is a calamity to be making tons of money by oppressing other people. and other people can make super rich people feel that way through the pressure of their condemnation. Although it's even more important for the rich themselves to put that pressure on each other. But you do have some entrepreneurs who are coming around to this view. In fact, some of them really disdain oppressive business models, but they should be more public about it.
So one of the things that we learned about in sort of stuff about class is that modern day democratization is kind of not really compatible with corporate responsibility. Yet the Puritan view that it's good to make money and that it's good to have this work ethic was kind of like a precursor to profit maximization, you were saying. How do they reconcile maximizing profits with still working for the good of the community? And why is that something that we haven't been able to?
Right. So on Baxter's formulation, the question is, how can you reconcile the Puritan demand to maximize your wealth with doing stuff that's it contributes to social welfare? And Baxter thought he could pull this off by constraining business people in such a way that they don't pursue any of these oppressive business models. And then the thinking is that the remaining welfare-promoting business models, for those, the measure of your contribution maybe is how much money you're making. Now, I think that's probably wrong because he wasn't really thinking about externalities. I mean, we're talking about before we have modern economics. So there's a lot more qualifications that have to be put into that. But remember also that in the 17th century, a lot of business was way more straightforward than it is today because most of the stuff being made was actually something that an ordinary consumer could evaluate. Right? I mean, when the apple's rotten. It's not that hard to tell. Whereas today, there's massive asymmetries of information that are being exploited. Like in higher education, where people whose families are not themselves highly educated are really clueless about the difference between a scam school and a real school. It's really hard for them to actually get access to the information to know when they're getting ripped off.
I like to talk a lot. One of the things I liked about it was the way you sort of mined intellectual history, including the Puritan tradition. But let me play devil's advocate. I mean, if I'm skeptical, if I'm a skeptical person, I might say you're not just quoting dead white males. You're quoting dead white males who are religious fanatics. And why should I take this seriously? Where's the authority?
So the question is, here I'm quoting these sort of religious fanatics, right, of the 17th century, or dead white men, so why should I take them as authorities? I'm not actually taking them as authorities. What I'm suggesting is they had some pretty good ideas, and we can read their arguments and see that some of them actually make some considerable sense. So no, I'm not asking you to take Milton as an authority, but I do think that Milton, for instance, think about what life would be like is if every worker could look forward to Monday thinking that they're better off going to work than being idle. That would be a pretty good state for workers, wouldn't it?
Do you have a proposed solution?
So this talk is really about promoting a certain ideal of what work ought to be for people. So many of you, I presume, aspire to be entrepreneurs, corporate leaders. It's up to you to figure out how to make it real. But no, what I'm suggesting is this is a worthier goal, something that you could look back on and say, I've had a worthwhile career. I haven't just slaked my vanity by ripping off people or by burning up the earth. I've made a positive contribution to other people. That's something really worth being proud of. And business is capable of being a vehicle of that. It's not just about money. In the end, money made by oppressing others really is a calamity. And that's what we should be thinking. There are a million ways to do it well, but that's for entrepreneurs to figure out, right? Each in their own way. There are millions and millions of positive business models that you could adopt. You got choices in front of you. Choose the good ones. In the corner.
I'm curious to know if you've read Bertrand Russell's In Praise of Idleness, and if so, if you could comment on that in relation to your presentation.
I'm sorry, Bertrand Russell's, what was the work?
In Praise of Idleness.
In Praise of Idleness. I have not read Russell's In Praise of Idleness, no, but he probably is in the Keynes tradition. Yeah, so Keynes himself in Economic Possibilities for our grandchildren did have a little bit of a worry about the leisure society because he looked at the idle rich in England and he realized that they actually weren't spending their idle ways in much of anything good. He considered it a challenge to figure out something worthwhile to do in one's leisure. And that's also a worthwhile thing. So I'm all in favor of paid vacations, but I think in the end, a totally hedonistic lifestyle where it's like leisure every day, for a lot of people, they actually want to be useful. It's important, not just indulge.
Thank you for the talk. I enjoyed it immensely. During this talk, I was under the impression that there were two presentations of the kinds of work ethic that's developed. There's the conservative conservative and the progressive conservative. I'm wondering if this presentation of the work ethic, of the two different kinds of work ethics, is too simple to account for today, I'd like to bring to mind there's an article in the Atlantic called "The Birth of the New American Aristocracy." It denotes a third class of people. There's a top 0.1% and the bottom 90%. But that middle group, the 9.9%, are people who are born to largely like upper middle class or middle class families who work incredibly hard, buying into what you categorize as the conservative disadvantaged work ethic. But in doing so, they also found deep meaning in their work, insofar as they were able to help their families rise out of like middle class status, or even from poverty in extreme cases. So I'm wondering if how you score with that demographic in this model of work ethic.
Well, I do. So the question is, what about the middle 9%? That is just below the 1%, but like between, like from the 90th to the 99th percentile of worker. I actually think that you're probably right that is the class that has most internalized the work ethic, but often in problematic ways. So it is true that is the class where you're seeing they're working overtime. And they are really dedicated to their work, but whether they're dedicated for good or bad reasons is the open question. Right? I mean, some of them really are. So let me just give you an example from the medical world. My husband is a physician, and he notes a difference between two different kinds of doctor. Okay, and some of them really they enter medicine to help patients. What could be more meaningful than that? But then you have another class of doctors who are in it for the lifestyle, high pay, quite a lot of vacation time, easy hours, and they're actually not all that dedicated to actually caring for patients. They're out to maximize the buck. And if you actually look at what's one of the pathologies of the American healthcare sector today, there are many pathologies, but one of them is that the ones who really just want to max out their income they're actually calling the shots on how healthcare is getting organized at the expense of doctors who actually want to help patients. I mean, there's a lot of what's going on in the healthcare world. Both of them are in, between 90 and 99th percentile, but they're pursuing very different models of a calling.
May I ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
I'll leverage my own experience coming from finance. I used to do consulting, and there's definitely at least two different kinds of candidates. One would be the people who are from middle class, and they do want to maximize money, but they want to maximize money because their parents weren't wealthy coming in. So it seems that there is a kind of meaning to it, not in the grand scheme of like doing public works or philanthropy in that sense. There seems to be a stronger, more than just crass conservative, I want to make the most money possible kind of work ethic, versus the others who are in it for the prestige or the money, etc. But I'm wondering, it seems like they might be lost in this model because they are just they're in it for the money, that's true, but they're in it for more meaningful reasons than they might be portrayed otherwise.
Right, so it could be that people who grew up in poverty, just making it can be really meaningful. And I agree with that. But it's still a very limited view. I think anyone who attains that level of well-being should be thinking really hard about the difference they're making in the world and not just for themselves and their family.